Another thing to consider in this time period, as we talk about relationships between church and state, has to be the different ways of persecutions that Christians faced throughout the 2nd, 3rd, and even into the 4th century. Now, persecution that Christians faced in those early centuries, I don't want to minimize it, but it was relatively rare to see any sort of concerted effort from Roman officials to persecute Christianity. So a lot of the persecution that Christians faced was on a local level, maybe troubles with local officials, or was more on a personal level, in the sense of losing a job, being disowned by family, losing wealth or economic opportunities, all of which, of course, would have been serious difficulties for those that faced it. But it wasn't a constant persecution from the state. However, there were some significant moments of persecution that did take place under several emperors who were attempting to get rid of the presence of Christians in their empire. One of those was an emperor named Decius, who lived in the middle of the 200s. Now, Decius was not particularly cruel. I want to kind of modify that a little bit, right? So he's engaging in persecution, but it's not coming from this deep, intense hatred of Christianity. It's coming from his concerns about Rome's glory. That doesn't make it any better, that doesn't make it right, but it is to say, okay, it's a little bit more complex than perhaps we often think of it. So essentially, for Decius, he believes that Rome has been declining because they have turned away from the gods. Some of that is due to Christians, some of that is due to the laxity of pagans and worshiping the gods, other types of things like that. So Decius wants this return to greatness for Rome. So he begins to require sacrifice of all people to the gods, and they have to be registered that they have done this. When it comes to Christianity, his desire is not to create a lot of martyrs. He is not interested in killing Christians. Instead, Decius would prefer that Christians would fall away from Christianity. That, he believes, is going to be of greater value than to kill a lot of people, which is, Decius kind of recognizes that if he kills a lot of people, that's just going to perpetuate Christianity. So he requires everyone to sacrifice, and when they sacrifice, they would get a piece of paper that essentially was a statement of a Roman official and the statement of the people that, we sacrificed on such and such date, and then it would be signed by the particular Roman official that signed it. Christians were not prepared for the persecution of Decius. In the years previous to this, it had been relatively quiet for Christians in general. And when Decius orders this, they are faced with an important question. What do you do? When the state tells you to sacrifice to the gods, how do you respond? Now, probably we would like to say, well, you don't sacrifice, and I believe that's the correct answer. However, that is a very easy answer to make when we are sitting in a time of relative peace and safety. When the government is pressing down on you, and there are some very real consequences to whether you sacrifice or not, it's a different situation. Well, certainly there were those that remained firm, that often ended up arrested. There were, however, Christians who offered the sacrifices. There were also Christians who got forged certificates, fake certificates, which there was supposed to be a way that was prevented, but it didn't work all the time. So essentially, you have a situation where some Christians remained firm, some fell away. So you're faced with that challenge. Then the challenge becomes, well, after the persecution eventually ends, and Decius dies and a new emperor comes up and there's relative peace and safety again, what do you do about those that sacrificed, those that got the forgeries? Should they be allowed to become part of the church again? Should it matter whether they actually sacrificed or whether they just got a forged document? Does it matter if they tried to repent while the persecution was going on? And so there were great differences among Christians about how you respond to, the aftermath when people kind of, feel the guilt of what they've done and want to return to the church. And so that becomes a very challenging period for Christians, and that happens a couple different times with Christians over this issue of persecution and sacrifice, etc. Other things that are taking place in the post-apostolic period is, again, you have this strict separation school, right? Tertullian, one of the apologists we talked about just a little bit ago, says, you need to stay away from the pursuit of pleasure in culture. You need to, if you participate in the game, you shouldn't participate in the games, any sort of athletic contests. Shouldn't wear the laurel crown if you win, because that says you accept the authority of the emperor. For Tertullian, you shouldn't be involved in Christian military service. Right? For some people, it was don't be involved in the military because of the violence that you were called upon to do. Others, because of you shouldn't be involved in the army or the military because you will be responsible, you will be expected to sacrifice to the emperor, and so there'll be idolatry there. On the other hand, toward the end of the 3rd century, there were more and more Christians that were less hostile to the state. And so you see situations where there are Christians in the military. There are Christians in positions within the government. So you begin to see some situations where there is changes going on in Christianity because Christianity is no longer automatically this kind of separate from society group. Now again, there are those moments of persecution that pop up where suddenly Christians are separated, right? There's a clear distinction. But toward the end of the 3rd century, the beginning of the 4th century, it is a change that is taking place. And that comes to a fullness with the ascension of Constantine to the Roman emperor. Constantine is a soldier, and the legions decide they want him to be emperor. And so Constantine takes his forces and heads towards Rome to take over. on his way there, he has an experience. There are kind of two different versions of this. One version says he has a dream, and in the dream he is shown the symbol, the key row symbol of Christianity, the key in the row, the first two Greek letters in the word Christos, Christ, that Christians are using as a symbol. And so in the dream he's told, put this symbol on your shields and you will conquer. Another version is that he sees a cross in the sky and hears a voice say, by this sign conquer. Either way, the tradition is that Constantine has this moment where he becomes convinced that the way to achieve his goals, the way to succeed, is to adopt elements of Christianity. So he is successful, eventually becomes the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. He kind of claims a Christian identity, but it's really kind of complex. He doesn't kind of follow the regular pattern of how someone became a Christian in the 4th century. He doesn't submit to church leadership, right, to a bishop, and he's not baptized until he's on his deathbed. Additionally, there are several instances where he kind of, hybridizes Christianity and paganism. Right, so he issues coins during his reign, which have the key row symbol on one side, a Christian symbol. On the other side is a symbol of the unconquered sun, the sun god. Right, so you have this pagan symbol on one side, you have this Christian symbol on the other side. However, he will take money from pagan temples and give it to Christian churches, or he'll take buildings and convert them into Christian churches. So Constantine is this really complex figure. Personally, when we say, okay, is Constantine the first Christian emperor or not? But then it also becomes a challenge for Christians, because whatever Constantine is spiritually, he is beginning to pass some laws that allow the free practice of Christianity. And really out of this, because he favors Christianity so much, there is a prestige and power that church leaders and bishops begin to take on because of the prominence, the favor that Constantine is giving them. And so the bishop office becomes a symbol of power and prestige, and people try to get that by buying it or through other means. Right? So it becomes open to corruption instead of, spiritual maturity. Bishops also begin to take on secular roles, not just about church leadership, but sometimes they're called upon to make judicial decisions, secular judicial decisions, which may, which means that they fall prey to bribes and to pressure, other things like that. The pomp, the imperial pomp of ceremonies makes its way into churches, and so bishops start wearing these long flowing robes. There are these processions into church buildings. It kind of suggests the authority of the bishops. And more, the distinction between the church and the world for a lot of Christians fades.